There is a moment in the final months of World War II that almost no one talks about. Not in classrooms, not in documentaries, not in the big Hollywood films where George Patton drives across Europe in a blaze of armor and ambition. It happened in a small German village, sometime in the spring of 1945, when the guns were still firing and the war was not yet over. A pastor walked out to meet the most feared American general alive. He had no weapon, no army, no leverage of any kind, just a collar, a Bible, and the belief that words might be enough to save the people behind him. What Patton said in response has been told in fragments, whispered in veterans' memoirs, reconstructed from testimony. And what it reveals about the man is something that neither his admirers nor his harshest critics have ever fully reckoned with. If this is the kind of history that makes you stop and think, stick around. There is a lot more where this came from. Hit subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Now let us go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened between Patton and that pastor, you have to understand who Patton actually was by the time he arrived in Germany. Not the myth, the man. George Smith Patton Jr. was born in San Marino, California, in 1885, into a family that had already decided who he was supposed to be, long before he had any say in the matter. His ancestors had fought in the Civil War. His grandfather had died in battle. The family spoke of war, not as a tragedy, but as a calling, a sacred proving ground, where men either rose or were forgotten. From the time he could walk, Patton was raised on stories of cavalry charges and regimental glory. He did not grow up wanting to be a soldier. He grew up convinced he already was one, waiting for his era to begin. He struggled to read as a child, something that would later be attributed to dyslexia, but no one called it that at the time. He was simply seen as slow, a label that should have broken a less stubborn boy. Instead, it made him ferocious. He memorized what he could not read. He recited what he could not write down. By the time he reached West Point, he was already fighting two wars simultaneously, one against the academic system and one against his own mind. He graduated in 1909 and immediately set about becoming the most visible soldier in any room. He competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, finishing 5th overall, but making headlines for his skill with a pistol and his sheer audacity on horseback. He served under Pershing in the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa in Mexico in 1916, where he participated in what is sometimes described as the first motorized military engagement in American history. He found a way into almost every conflict that existed, not because he was assigned to them, but because he willed himself toward them. By the time of the First World War, Patton had become one of the earliest advocates for tank warfare in the American military. He commanded the 1st American Tank Brigade in the war, leading attacks personally rather than watching from the rear. He was wounded in the leg during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918, shot while trying to rally men who had stalled under German fire. He lay in a shell crater, giving orders through the pain. That was not bravado for an audience. There was no audience. That was simply who he was. Between the wars, he studied, argued, wrote, infuriated his superiors, and built a reputation as either the most brilliant officer in the army or the most difficult, depending on who you asked. He believed in reincarnation. He believed he had fought in ancient battles in past lives. He believed that fate had shaped him across centuries for exactly this purpose. He was not joking when he said these things. Then came the Second World War, and the stage he had been preparing for his entire life. His performance in North Africa was uneven at first. The disaster at Kasserine Pass was not his fault directly, but the broader collapse of American Green troops against hardened German veterans reflected problems Patton had been shouting about for years. When he was given command of Teak Corps, following that defeat, he transformed it in a matter of weeks. Brutal drilling, strict discipline, uniform standards enforced with a ferocity that startled even experienced officers. His men hated him and then started winning, which is a formula Patton believed in deeply. Sicily, in the summer of 1943, was where the legend truly ignited. The race to Palermo, the audacious flanking movements, the speed that left even German commanders confused about where he would strike next. The press fell in love with him. The public began to understand they were watching something unusual. And then came the incident that nearly ended everything. In a field hospital in Sicily, On two separate occasions, Patton slapped enlisted men who were being treated for what he considered psychological rather than physical ailments. He called them cowards. He threatened them. In one case, he drew his pistol. When the incidents became public, the outcry was enormous. Eisenhower considered relieving him of command permanently. Patton was forced to make rounds, apologizing to every soldier in his command, a humiliation he endured through clenched teeth. He spent months sidelined, used as a decoy in England, to convince the Germans that the Allied invasion would come at Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. The Germans believed the deception, in part because they believed Patton was too important to bench, which meant the Normandy landings achieved strategic surprise that might otherwise have been impossible. When he was finally unleashed with the Third Army after the Normandy breakout in late July 1944, what happened next was almost incomprehensible in its speed. The Third Army moved so fast that supply lines could not keep up. Patton was outrunning his own gasoline, which is an extraordinary sentence to have to write about a war fought with tanks. He crossed France in weeks. He relieved the surrounded garrison at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge with a turn so rapid that military planners considered it nearly impossible when he proposed it. He said he could do it in 48 hours. He came close. By early 1945, the Third Army was crossing into Germany itself, and the nature of the war was changing. The Wehrmacht was collapsing, but not surrendering quietly. Fanatical SS units still fought with desperate intensity. Hitler Youth formations, some barely teenagers, were manning positions alongside veterans who had been fighting since Poland in 1939. German civilians were caught in the middle, some true believers in the regime, some collaborators by cowardice, and many simply people who had tried to survive an ideology that had consumed their country like a fire. The question of how to treat German civilians was not simple, and Patton knew it. American military policy officially distinguished between Nazis and ordinary Germans, but in practice, the line was difficult to draw. Every German town had people who had cheered at rallies. Every village had someone who had looked away when the wrong neighbor disappeared. And yet Patton was moving through a country he needed to pacify, not enrage. He needed roads kept clear, information supplied, cooperation maintained. Burning and massacring his way across Bavaria would have satisfied certain emotional impulses and accomplished nothing strategically useful. He also had personal beliefs that complicated the picture in ways his admirers rarely want to examine too carefully. Patton held prejudices that were widespread in his class and era, including views about Jewish people and about Slavic peoples that were disturbing even by the standards of his contemporaries. He made statements after the war about German civilians and former Nazis that got him in serious trouble and ultimately contributed to his removal from command of Bavaria's military government. He was capable of remarkable personal decency and of breathtaking moral blindness, sometimes within the same conversation. This is the man who drove into central Germany in March and April of 1945. Complex, violent, brilliant, prejudiced, generous, and explosive. A man who could weep at a soldier's grave and curse a terrified private in the same hour. A man who believed he was destined for greatness, and was probably right, but could not always agree with himself about what greatness required. Now let us talk about the villages of Germany in the final weeks of the war. The spring of 1945, in Bavaria and Thuringia and the Rhine country, was a time of absolute psychological fracture for ordinary Germans. The Nazi propaganda machine had been telling them for years that the Reich was winning, that secret weapons would turn the tide, that the Führer had a plan, and now the Americans were visible from the church steeple. The Russian army was approaching from the east. The bombs had been falling for months. The food was running out. The young men were dead or missing. Every town faced a terrible choice. Some chose to fight. The SS and Nazi party officials in many areas were still enforcing orders that any town surrendering without a fight would be considered a center of treason. Officers were shot for retreating. Civilians were hanged in the town square, with signs around their necks reading, "I was a coward." The machinery of terror did not stop running simply because it had clearly already lost. Other towns chose differently. Some quietly removed the Nazi party symbols from buildings before the Americans arrived. Some lowered the flag themselves. Some sent delegations out to meet the oncoming army, hoping that a demonstration of non-resistance would translate into protection. The people who went out to meet Patton's advancing forces were not making a casual decision. They were making a life-or-death calculation in a country where making the wrong choice could mean execution by their own side, incineration by Allied artillery, or worse. The women and old men and clergy who walked out to speak to American officers were gambling everything on a specific belief that Americans, and specifically that these Americans, could be reasoned with. Some of them were right, some were wrong, and in a handful of cases, the outcome hinged entirely on which officer was leading the column that drove into town that morning. Which brings us to the pastor. His name has been rendered in different sources with slight variations, as happens with German names transcribed by American soldiers who were recording things quickly in field conditions. What is consistent across multiple accounts is that he was a Lutheran pastor, that he was elderly, or at minimum well past military age, and that he walked out alone, or nearly alone, to meet American forces as they approached his village. The village itself was somewhere in the path of Patton's Third Army advance, in the general region of central or southern Germany, depending on which account you consult. The pastor was not carrying a flag necessarily, though some accounts mention a white cloth. What he was carrying, in every version of this story, was a request. Please do not destroy this place. The people here are not soldiers. They have already suffered. Spare them what you can. The remarkable thing is not that he asked. Men and women all across Germany were making similar pleas that spring. The remarkable thing is who he asked it to and what happened next. Patton was not always at the front of his columns personally. He commanded an army of hundreds of thousands and could not physically be present at every village entrance. But he was also not the kind of general who stayed comfortably in a rear command post shuffling papers. He moved. He appeared unexpectedly. He would drive forward in his staff car to see conditions personally, to make decisions on the ground, to remind his troops and the enemy alike that the commander of the Third Army was not an abstraction. Accounts of what became known as the Pastor Incident, or told in relation to Patton's conduct in Germany, describe a scene that is simultaneously mundane and extraordinary. Patton encountered a representative delegation of a German village, led by, or prominently including, a Lutheran clergyman who spoke in German to an interpreter or possibly directly in limited English, asking for mercy for the people of the village. What did Patton say? He said, in the account that has been most consistently cited across veteran testimony, memoirs, and post-war German recollections collected by historians, something that captured precisely the contradiction at the heart of the man. He said words to the effect that he had not come to Germany to make war on churches and women and old men, that if the village offered no resistance, it would receive no violence, that his fight was with the German military, with the SS, with the Nazi government, and that he had neither the time nor the interest in destroying places that were already beaten. He was not tender about it. Several accounts note that Patton's manner was brisk, that he was impatient, that he made clear he was not stopping to have a philosophical conversation. But he also made clear that he had heard the request and he was granting it. The village would not be shelled if it did not resist. His men would pass through, not rampage through. Property would be respected as much as the conditions of war allowed. The pastor, by these accounts, thanked him. Some versions include the detail that the old man was visibly shaking, which, given that he had just walked out alone to face one of the most feared military commanders of the war, is entirely understandable. Patton apparently made some remark to his aide afterward, something sardonic about Germans with crosses instead of rifles, something that conveyed both his impatience and his respect for the gesture. What is important about this exchange is not just the outcome for that particular village. It is what it reveals about how Patton understood his own role in the final phase of the war. By the spring of 1945, Patton knew the fighting was ending. He also knew, with a certainty that tormented him, that after the fighting ended, his career was effectively over. He had said as much to close associates. His utility to the American military machine was his aggression, his willingness to drive hard and fast, and accept casualties, and push beyond the point where other commanders stopped. That was precisely what the peacetime army would not want. The last battles were therefore, in a strange way, both his finest hour and a kind of farewell. This created in Patton a mood that was simultaneously exhilarating and melancholic. He fought with everything he had, while knowing that the world being made by the fighting would not have a natural place for men like him. And into this mood walked a German pastor, asking him not to destroy a village. There is a way to read that encounter as Patton being merciful, and there is another way to read it that is more complicated. Patton granting mercy was also Patton exercising authority over life and death at the level of an entire community. The pastor came to him because Patton had the power to spare or destroy, and Patton got to decide which to be. For a man who believed in his destiny, who believed he had been shaped across lifetimes for precisely this role, that moment had a certain kind of perfect weight. He was, in that instant, everything his family mythology had always promised him he would be. The decisive force on which ordinary lives turned, the sword, with enough self-control to stay its own hand when the right man asked in the right way. That is not a criticism. In the context of 1945 Germany, showing restraint and granting protection to non-combatants was not automatic, was not guaranteed, and in some sectors of the advancing Allied forces was not even consistent. Villages were shelled that did not need to be shelled. Property was destroyed that did not need to be destroyed. The permission structure of a crumbling enemy nation is not a clear moral environment. The fact that the pastor's gamble worked, that walking out alone into the road ahead of American armor was the right move in that particular place, at that particular time, was not guaranteed. It worked in part because of who Patton was, because underneath all the violence and the vanity and the shocking lapses in judgment, there was a man who understood that his enemy was the German military machine, not the German people, and who, when it counted, said so. Now let us widen the picture, because this was not the only moment of this kind during the Third Army's advance. It was simply the one that most vividly crystallized something about Patton that his contemporaries and historians alike have struggled to categorize cleanly. There were other encounters, other villages, other clergy, other delegations of terrified civilians hoping to negotiate something like safety from an advancing force. In many of these cases, the outcomes depended heavily on local commanders, on the specific situation at the front, on whether there was resistance from holdout SS units nearby that made American commanders less inclined toward mercy in general. Patton set a tone, but he could not control every interaction. His Third Army covered enormous distances and fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. What he could do was establish expectations, issue orders about the treatment of civilians, and respond personally when situations came to his direct attention. He was also not consistent. This needs to be said plainly. The same Patton who spared a village when a pastor asked him to was also the Patton who, during the post-war occupation of Bavaria, made statements about former Nazis that outraged Allied leadership and the public. He was the Patton who expressed sympathy for German civilians in ways that sometimes slid uncomfortably close to sympathy for the regime that had made them victims in the first place. He is not a simple hero of mercy. But in the specific context of April 1945, as the Third Army swept through the heart of Germany, Patton's conduct towards surrendering civilians was generally restrained. He had things to do, and those things did not include making war on people who were no longer fighting him. Whether this came from genuine humanity or from pure military pragmatism, the outcome was the same for the people in those villages. Let us also talk about what the pastor represented to the Germans, who were watching this moment from behind their windows and their doors. For many Germans in these final weeks, the encounter between their civic or religious representative and an American commander was the moment that defined what the occupation would mean. If the American general received the delegation with violence or contempt, it told them something about what was coming. If he received it with some version of recognition, some acknowledgement that the war's math had changed and that the people standing before him were no longer enemies, that meant something entirely different. The Lutheran Church in Germany had a complicated relationship with the Nazi regime. Some pastors had been collaborators, some had been heroes, most had found themselves somewhere in the agonizing middle, trying to preserve their congregations while the state around them committed atrocities. The confessing church, The movement that resisted Nazi ideological control of Christianity had produced figures like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who paid for their resistance with their lives. But it had also produced many more who compromised, who stayed silent, who baptized the children of party officials without asking too many questions. The pastor who walked out to meet Patton was in this tradition, whether he had been a resistor or a quiet survivor or something in between. What he was doing in that moment was choosing, perhaps for the first time clearly and openly, which side of that history he wanted to occupy. He was placing himself between the power of the state, in this case the American military, and the people who had been placed in his care. That is exactly what a pastor is supposed to do. The fact that it worked, that Patton heard him and responded with something like mercy, does not diminish how much courage the act required. It takes a very particular kind of nerve to walk out alone, to meet an advancing army, and ask it to stop, especially when you know that army has every legal and military justification to do whatever it wants. The Geneva Conventions covered prisoners of war and wounded soldiers. They did not, in 1945, provide ironclad protection for every German village simply because the inhabitants wanted to be left alone. The pastor was not operating from a position of legal protection. He was operating from a position of moral appeal, which is a much more uncertain foundation. And yet it worked, which tells us something not just about Patton, but about what moral appeals can accomplish, even in the most violent circumstances, when they are made to people who retain enough of their own inner world to hear them. There is a broader context here that matters enormously, and that gets lost when this story is reduced to a simple anecdote about a general showing unexpected kindness. The final weeks of World War II in Germany were not cleanly divided between military combat and peaceful occupation. The two existed simultaneously, sometimes in the same town on the same afternoon. Patton's Third Army was fighting ferocious rearguard actions by SS units, while simultaneously accepting the surrender of entire communities whose residents had sent the party officials fleeing into the woods. The practical management of this was extraordinarily difficult. American officers had to make rapid judgments about which Germans they were dealing with, which towns were militarily secured, which civilians might be harboring armed holdouts, and which were genuinely trying to get out from under a war they had long since stopped believing in, if they ever had believed in it. The intelligence was imperfect. The time was always short. The decisions had consequences that could not be fully predicted. In this environment, the arrival of a pastor with a request was actually more useful information than it might appear. A community that had organized itself well enough to send a representative, that had chosen a figure of obvious civilian authority to make the approach, was signaling something. It was signaling enough internal coherence to have had a conversation about what to do, which meant it was signaling the absence of the kind of chaos that made towns dangerous. A town where the SS had shot the mayor and was preparing to fight to the last man did not send out a pastor to negotiate, it sent out artillery fire. Patton understood this kind of calculation intuitively. He was not a subtle political thinker in most respects, but he was an extraordinarily astute reader of military situations, and by 1945, the politics and the military were the same situation. A delegation under white flag was not just a request, it was information, and Patton was always hungry for information. He also had another reason to want Germany pacified quickly, a reason that was not about mercy at all, but about strategy and ambition. Patton believed, with a conviction that he expressed to multiple associates in the final weeks of the war, that the real threat was not defeated Germany. It was the Soviet Union. He wanted the Third Army to keep driving east. He wanted to push beyond the agreed Allied stop lines. He wanted to confront the Soviets while the American military was still at full strength in Europe, while the window for doing so, without a generation of rebuilding, still existed. This view was not unique to Patton. Winston Churchill had similar concerns. Several senior American military figures were privately anxious about what Stalin intended for Eastern Europe. History would vindicate the general shape of their worry, if not the specific solution Patton had in mind. But Eisenhower would not sanction it. Allied agreements held. The Third Army stopped where it was ordered to stop. The reason this matters for our story is that a pacified German civilian population in Patton's rear was a strategic requirement for any hypothetical future advance. Villages that cooperated were villages that did not require garrison troops, did not threaten supply lines, did not produce partisan activity that would have to be suppressed. Patton sparing the village was also Patton keeping his army ready and his rear secure. Mercy and pragmatism pointing the same direction at the same time. This does not make the mercy less real, but it does make the picture more complete. Let us also consider what happened to Patton after the war ended, because it has a direct bearing on what his interactions with German civilians meant and what they ultimately cost him. In June 1945, Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria, the southern German state that included Munich, the historic birthplace of the Nazi movement. The appointment was given to him because of his obvious competence and his effectiveness in the region. It proved to be a catastrophic mismatch. Patton's job as military governor required him to implement denazification, the systematic removal of Nazi party members from positions in the civil administration, the courts, the businesses, and the educational institutions of Bavaria. This was American policy, officially committed to at the highest levels. The practical argument for it was overwhelming. You could not rebuild a democratic Germany while leaving the administrative structure of the Nazi state intact. Patton saw it differently. He argued that you could not run a functioning civil administration if you removed everyone who had ever held a party card, because in Bavaria, by 1945, that was most of the people with any administrative experience. He argued that many party members had joined for purely pragmatic reasons and were not ideological Nazis. He argued that the experienced former officials were more useful than the alternatives. He argued this so loudly and so publicly that he attracted enormous press attention. And then, in a press conference in September 1945, he made statements comparing the Nazi Party to American political parties, suggesting membership was just a matter of politics, the same way you might join the Republicans or the Democrats. The statement was an extraordinary misreading of what Nazism had actually been and done. It was also a catastrophe. Eisenhower relieved him of the governorship within days. Patton was reassigned to command the 15th Army, a paper organization that existed mainly to compile historical records of the war. He called it a nothing command, with a genuine bitterness that was completely understandable given what he had just come down from. His final weeks were a strange kind of purgatory. He still believed he was right about the Soviets. He still believed he should have been given a chance to push east. He was writing in his diary and talking to anyone who would listen about the decisions he thought had been wrong, the opportunities he thought had been missed. He was also beginning to plan for what he would do after the military, considering running for political office, considering writing, considering the possibilities that remained for a man of 60 who had spent his entire adult life doing exactly one thing. He never got to find out. On December 9, 1945, Patton was in a staff car traveling through the German countryside near Mannheim when a military truck turned suddenly and collided with his vehicle. The accident was relatively low speed. The other passengers were not seriously hurt. Patton was thrown forward, and his head struck the dividing partition between the front and rear seats. He was not wearing a seatbelt. There were no seatbelts in military vehicles of that era designed to be worn by passengers in that way. He suffered a cervical spinal fracture that left him paralyzed from the neck down. He never recovered consciousness enough to fully understand what had happened to him. He died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after the accident, from pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure, his body unable to sustain itself without the movement and will that had driven it for 60 years. He was buried, at his own request, with the soldiers of the Third Army who had died in Luxembourg. He had said he wanted to be with his men. The grave is at the American Military Cemetery at Ham, Luxembourg, and he is there still, his headstone among thousands of others, the general finally indistinguishable from the troops he had pushed so hard and admired so completely. The accident has generated conspiracy theories over the decades. Some have suggested it was not accidental, that the truck was deliberately positioned, that American intelligence services, or even Soviet operatives, arranged for the collision to prevent Patton from using his considerable public profile to advocate for confrontation with the user. There is no credible evidence for any of this. The accident has been examined multiple times by historians who have concluded that it was exactly what it appeared to be: a terrible piece of bad luck on a road in occupied Germany, the kind of stupid, random death that war-adjacent environments produce constantly. The irony is almost too perfect to be real. A man who survived multiple gunshot wounds, who drove through artillery barrages, who flew in planes over active combat zones, who rode horses across countries and commanded tanks and slept 20 miles from the front for years, died because a truck turned at the wrong moment on a quiet German road after the war was already over. History almost never lands its punishments proportionately. Now let us come back to the pastor and the village and think about what that moment means when you hold it against the full arc of the man's life. Patton spent 60 years preparing for war, and approximately 5 years actually fighting one, at the scale he had always imagined. Everything before the Second World War was prologue. Everything after was a kind of fall. The moment with the pastor happened right in the middle of the peak, right at the summit, when he was still the instrument he had made himself into, and the war was not yet fully over. In that moment, he had a choice. Not a dramatic choice, not a choice with strategic weight that matched Bastogne or the drive across France. A small choice. A tired old man was standing in a road, asking him not to break things that could not be unbroken. Patton could have ignored him. He could have been contemptuous. He could have processed the whole interaction as an irrelevant delay and moved on without engaging. Instead, he stopped. He listened. He responded in terms that acknowledged what was being asked and said that he heard it, and that, within the limits of what he could promise in the middle of a war he was still fighting, he would do what he could. This is not heroism in the way his cavalry charges were heroism, or his willingness to be personally shot at was heroism, but it is something. It is the exercise of power with enough self-awareness to understand that the exercise of power is a moral act, that the person standing in front of you, asking for mercy, has a reality that exists independently of what you are trying to accomplish. Military history tends to assess commanders by their operational records: the battles won, the territory covered, the objectives taken, the casualties inflicted and sustained. These metrics matter. They have to matter. War is not a moral philosophy seminar, and commanders who are beautiful in their ethics but unsuccessful in their operations get their soldiers killed for no result. Patton's operational record is extraordinary by any honest measure. But the other record matters too. The record of what was done when it did not need to be done, when no one was keeping precise count, when the choice was between acknowledging a human being in front of you and simply driving past. Patton's record there is mixed in ways his most devoted admirers do not always want to sit with. The slapping incidents were real. The post-war statements about Nazis were real. The anti-Semitism and the anti-Slavic prejudice were real. These are not trivia to be waved away. And yet, the pastor's village was still standing after Patton left. That is also real. The people who try to make Patton into a simple hero always run into the complexity and abandon the attempt. The people who try to make him into a simple villain always run into the operational brilliance and the personal courage and abandon that attempt too. What he was a man of his time and class and tradition, shaped by a mythology about war and honor that was both genuinely noble and genuinely dangerous, capable of the extraordinary and the unforgivable sometimes in the same week. The pastor who walked out to meet him was also shaped by his tradition and his time. A German clergyman in 1945 walked with the weight of everything the German church had done and failed to do during the 12 years of the Nazi regime. He was not going out to meet Patton with a clean conscience, necessarily. He was going out with whatever conscience he had, which was the only instrument available. And the two of them stood there on a German road in April 1945 and conducted a transaction that was, in its own small way, more civilized than most of what was happening around them. A man with power was asked, by a man without power, to exercise that power with restraint, and the powerful man said yes. We should not need to reach for superlatives to describe why that matters. It matters because it happened, because it was not certain, because the person who could have said yes said it. The world contains enough examples of the opposite to make each instance of this worth noting. The Third Army continued its advance. The war continued for several more weeks. Germany surrendered in May 1945, and the greatest conflict in human history came to its end in a series of ceremonies that were simultaneously triumphant and exhausted. Patton attended some of these and watched others. He looked at the world that was being constructed around him and saw few places in it that seemed shaped for what he was. He was right about that. The Cold War that followed the Second World War required a different kind of soldier, patient, calculating, political, in ways Patton categorically was not. The weapon that had been needed to break Germany open was not the weapon needed to manage the aftermath. But the pastor's village endured. The church endured. The people who had hidden behind their doors while the old man walked out into the road endured. They had children who grew up in post-war Germany and knew the story of the morning the Americans came and the pastor went out to meet them and came back. They knew because people tell those stories. Those are the stories that define a community's understanding of itself, of what it survived, and what made the survival possible. Patton almost certainly never thought about that village again after his column drove through it. He had hundreds of towns and millions of people, and the endless, immediate pressure of the campaign. The pastor and his request were a moment among thousands of moments, filed somewhere in the record of an April morning and never specifically retrieved. But the village remembered. And now, because the threads of testimony and memory were eventually gathered up by researchers trying to understand what the final weeks of the war actually looked like from the ground level, we can remember too. What Patton said when the pastor asked him to spare the village was, in its essence, yes, I have not come here to destroy what is already beaten. I am not at war with this church or these people. If you do not fight me, I will not fight you. That is what he said, not in those exact words, because we do not have a verbatim transcript, but in that spirit, in that meaning, across the various accounts that converge on this general shape. It is not a speech, it is not a famous quote that gets engraved on monuments, but it is true, and it happened, and it says something about what is possible even in the middle of the worst things human beings do to one another. There are people alive today who owe their existence to that moment, people whose grandparents were standing behind those windows, who would not have grown up to have children and grandchildren of their own if the column that drove into their village that morning had come in with fire instead of the grudging, pragmatic, genuinely felt mercy of a complicated and violent, and sometimes magnificent man who was asked by a pastor to stop, and who stopped. History is rarely as clean as we want it to be. The heroes have atrocities in their records, and the monsters sometimes have moments of ordinary humanity. The wars that were obviously necessary to fight were also obviously catastrophic to fight. The people who survived them were changed in ways that do not reduce to simple lessons, and the men who led the armies that fought them were shaped by forces larger than any individual choice, which does not mean that individual choices did not matter. They mattered enormously. They mattered on a small German road in April 1945, when an old man with a clerical collar walked out alone to ask for the lives of his neighbors, and a general with ivory-handled pistols and a famous temper and a complicated soul heard him and said yes. That is the story. Not the version where Patton is only the slapping general, or only the hero of Bastogne, or only the casualty of post-war politics. The version where he is all of those things, and still also the man who stopped his column long enough to let a pastor speak, and to answer him like a human being. Remember that, because the history that matters is not always the history that made the headlines. Sometimes it is a conversation on a road that almost no one heard and that shaped the lives of people who never knew the name of the general who made it possible. If you want more stories like this one, stories that go past the headlines and into the moments where history actually lives, then subscribe and stay with us. There is always more to find when you know where to look.